Look at them mats.
The second you hit record. What's going on, you guys? Motorcycle Boss here. We got a 2013 636 and it needs a brake bleeding taken care of. It hasn't had its brakes bled for over 3 years and it's a little overdue, so we'll knock that out. I'm also going to be using this brake bleeder from Fit Tools, and we'll actually see how well it performs. It's going to be the first time I'm going to use this specific one. I used to have a Harbor Freight one, but this one seems to be better built, so we'll see how it turns out. Let's get to it. First thing we're going to do, you're going to want to level the reservoir if you can. This bracket's bent, so I'm going to try and see what I can do about that. But you want to try and level it out. It might have to be this way or the other way. There's going to be a screw on the side that's holding this top cap on, so we'll loosen that up real quick. Make sure you don't drop it. We'll set that off to the side. We're going to take this cap off. And you should have a rubber bladder. And before we move further from here, we're going to want to cover these parts with a towel. So make sure you guys are wearing gloves when you try and do this. It's not going to be good for your skin. It contains carcinogens that your skin can absorb, and it's not going to be a good day for you. It also strips paint, so you want to try and get rags over any painted surface that you can. Just make sure that it doesn't get on anything, and if it does, make sure you clean it with soapy water as soon as you can. So once we take this cap off, we have this rubber little bladder here. We're going to set that to the side. You're going to want to notice the level of brake fluid that's inside. This is important because we're going to end up taking all this brake fluid out and we're going to be replacing it. We have to make sure that we set it at the exact same level. The tool I showed you in the very beginning is a vacuum bleeder, and it just creates a vacuum through this hose. And I'm actually going to take the end off so that way I can suck all this brake fluid out. And you can also use a turkey baster or something similar, whatever you got, but we're just going to try and get all of this out. We're also going to get a rag. We're going to wipe it clean. Make sure you're using a dust-free cloth. I'm going to get all that old brake fluid out. Still being mindful of making sure that none of this gets on any painted surfaces. So we're going to fill this back up with fresh brake fluid now, so that way whenever we draw anything through the lines, it's going to pull in fresh brake fluid. It's not going to try and pull in that old brake fluid. The brake fluid you want to use is going to be dictated on the cap that was here, and on this one it says to use .4. We got some .4 brake fluid, and we're just going to add it up. Doesn't matter if you overfill, because we're going to end up drawing all this through the lines in a second. We're going to start off by doing the conventional bleed method. This is just a bottle that you make sure it's dry, it doesn't have any water in it. You're going to fill it with the brake fluid that you're going to be using for the application. You're going to pierce a hole in the top, just enough for a tube to go through. And this is, just aquarium tubing or whatever. Just something that'll fit the bleed nipple we're about to put it on. And you want to make sure that the tube ends down below the brake fluid level. So make sure it's below it. We're going to do this because we don't want the line to have any air in it when we get started, and then it's going to suck up air into it. We don't want that. Air is our enemy at this point. We want to make sure that we're only letting fresh, clean brake fluid go through the system. And I'll show you guys how to apply this setup. So we're going to start at the top. We already filled up fresh fluid inside here. Now the next step down is going to be the master cylinder bleed nipple up here. Not all bikes have this. Some service manuals tell you start from the bottom up, some say start from the top down. Just follow your bike specific service manual, tell you the proper procedure on bleeding your brakes. For this application, I'm going to start from the top and work my way down. So we already took care of the fluid inside the reservoir, and you want to make sure that this never runs dry while we're doing this procedure. We're going to start by taking the bleed nipple dust cap off. so we can expose the bleed nipple. We're going to take the other end of the tube. We're going to stick it over the bleed nipple. And you want to make sure that this is as far on as it can go, as long as it doesn't cover the hexagonal shape on the back. Just make sure it covers the nipple completely. We want this to be as much of an airtight seal as we can get it. So what we're going to do now, we're going to start to pump the brakes. As we do this process, this is going to get filled with brake fluid, and as that happens, it's going to be using new brake fluid from the reservoir, so be careful to make sure that this does not drop down and suck in air. You want to make sure this stays topped off. That's critical throughout this entire brake bleeding process. So next step, we're going to start to pump the brake until we get a firm feel and firm pressure. We're going to put a wrench on the bleed nipple, and once we get a couple of pumps, we're going to hold pressure. And as we open the bleed nipple with holding pressure, the brake lever is going to fall to the grip. It's going to relieve pressure. Make sure you keep it in this position until you tighten the bleed nipple again. So go ahead and tighten. And then you can start pumping again until you get firm pressure. And once you get firm pressure, you're going to hold again. You're going to crack the bleed nipple. And every time you crack this bleed nipple, you're getting brake fluid forced out into this tube going to the water bottle. You're going to close it and then continue to pump. You're going to repeat this until it comes about halfway down, because this brake fluid doesn't have much to travel. If you were to let go without closing the bleed nipple and you didn't have this particular setup, it could suck in air. And like I said before, air is our enemy, so we don't want to have any air in our system. And I'll go over all of the reasons why at the end of the video. So we're just going to continue to do this process until we're at about half a reservoir. Whenever you're doing this, you're going to make sure, go ahead and pump the brake. Whenever you crack this open, you're going to pay attention to the fluid that flows through here, and you want to make sure you don't see any air bubbles. And if you do, you got to keep going. So we're going to see if we see any air bubbles, and we saw nothing. And we're at half a reservoir. You can go ahead and close it. So now we're going to top off the reservoir. Now that we're done with the master cylinder, you always want to make sure that we top off the reservoir right about there, and then we're going to move on to the calipers. Before I get started, I actually want to go over this tool really quick. The tool I'm using is a Fit Tools brake bleeder. I'll end up posting the item number if I can. And I had to upgrade to this one because I used to have a Harbor Freight one and it broke. Actually, this is the Harbor Freight handle that I used to have, and it broke right here. And then I started to lose pressure, and then it actually wasn't able to suck anymore. So the components of this, you have a handle, and this one's made of metal. You have a trigger. There's going to be a hold, a little tab that holds it in place, so that way you can set it and forget it. It has a little hole right here, so you can attach a hook or whatever you want. You actually have a hook over here, and this way you can hook it up so it can just chill there while it's doing its job. You have a reservoir tank down here, and there's brake fluid inside here. And when you pull the trigger, air is going to go across here, and it's going to create a negative pressure inside. Basically, it's going to create a vacuum inside this chamber. There's a tube right here that transfers some of that vacuum to this little nipple right here. And this nipple is removable, so if you just want to suck up coolant or gas or whatever you want, you can do that. And it just goes right back on, no problem. This end is specifically made for brake bleed nipples. It fits right over there, makes an airtight seal, and then you're able to go at a 90-degree angle to suck the brake fluid into the reservoir tank. So one thing I've already noticed about this is, for one, build construction is way better. I'm extremely happy with the way this is built. This is the Harbor Freight one I showed you a second ago, and notice how everything here is all plastic. It's all plastic, and right here, this is where there's a good failure point. I've even heard of some people actually getting this whole section right here to snap off. I didn't get to that point, but it did crack, and every time I used it, you could tell that there was a vacuum leak. So the other thing about the Harbor Freight is when you pull this trigger in and you try to get this is where it stops right here. This doesn't really want to go, so you kind of have to force it in place to get it to stay, and then you have to kind of do the same thing to get it off. So it's kind of a pain, especially when you're doing stuff like this with a small compressor. This one, on the other hand, squeeze. Let me find it. Squeeze. Oh yeah, there we go. Squeeze, flip, easy. Squeeze, drop. You don't really have to force it. Now, the other thing I did notice, and I don't have the reservoir for Harbor Freight to show, but this actually has a drain port on the bottom, and it's not threaded, but it is double O-ring sealed. And I don't know if you can see that. It has 2 O-rings here, which is pretty awesome. And this is nice because it keeps stress points off the top and just pops back in, no problem, and it doesn't leak at all. I already have brake fluid inside this, I'm not getting any brake fluid. And this is from earlier. So right here, this would normally be a stress point similar to this. But because this is made of metal and they give you a drain port on the bottom, there's no need for you to constantly take this on and off, so you don't have to worry about that stress point. And it's made of metal, so it's stronger. I feel like this is way better built than the Harbor Freight tool. And we're finally going to put it to the test right now. So this does work off of shop air. I have an air hose right here. This is just a fitting that I'm using for now because I had a hard time finding an adapter. But we're just going to plug it up to some shop air, and then that way when you pull the trigger, it can start working. So we're going to start to bleed the brakes now. So like I said, follow your service manual on the recommended way to go about it. Some people go further and get closer. Some people go closer to the master cylinder and go away. So follow the service manual. We're going to start with the right side caliper. On the top of the caliper, you're normally going to find a bleed nipple somewhere around the top. We're going to take the dust cover off. I'm going to clean that up a little bit, trying to make sure it's an airtight seal. We're going to get the nipple from the Fit Tools bleeder. We're going to stick that on. I'm actually going to come this way. Stick it on. So we're going to start to bleed it. Alright, when you're using this tool, you want to make sure that before you crack the bleed nipple, this tool is on. That's first and foremost. Once you crack the bleed nipple, it's going to start to suck brake fluid through the calipers, through the brake lines, through the master cylinder, and through the it's going to pull from the reservoir. While this is on and this is cracked, make sure you continue to top off the brake fluid reservoir and make sure it never runs dry. We're going to let this run until about 2 to 3 cycles of it dropping and filling the reservoir up top. So I'm going to go ahead and start it, and we're going to crack the nipple open, and then you're going to see brake fluid start to flow. So now we got done bleeding the brakes, and you want to make sure that the reservoir is the same level as it was when it first rolled in. And this one's a little overfilled, so I'm going to make sure that I use this vacuum bleeder. I'm going to suck some of the excess out. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take this rubber shield, I guess I'd call it. I don't know the exact term. Make sure you clean the inside of this well, because sometimes brake fluid can get on the opposite side, and then once you put the cap on, you'll notice it start leaking. So clean it really, really well. I'm going to set that in. There we go. We're going to get the cap. I'm going to set the cap on it. Have the clamp. Everything that we just did with the front brake fluid reservoir directly affects the front braking system, and the front braking system only. This is the rear brake fluid reservoir. It's going to be located in different locations depending on your year, make, and model. This one only affects the rear braking system, and you're going to want to follow the exact same steps for the rear independently of the front. After you get the brake bleed finished, you're going to want to let the bike sit for a little bit, preferably overnight. You're going to pump the brake a little bit, hold pressure, and you're going to throw a zip tie over it, and you're going to let it sit just like that overnight. And then probably either before you leave or when you come back, you're going to want to actually tap some of the brake lines from the bottom all the way up. And what's going to happen is the bubbles are going to end up flowing all the way up the brake lines, and they're going to make their way up to the master cylinder. In the morning, cut the zip tie, and what's going to happen is any of that excess air that's built up behind the master cylinder is going to pop into the reservoir, and then you're going to have a better brake feel. You're done with the brake service, you're going to have a reservoir that has a good amount of brake fluid in it. So go ahead and make sure that you dispose of it properly. You can throw this in an oil can just for bad oil. Go ahead and just dump that in there. Be environmentally friendly. When you do this service, make sure you're using an unopened bottle of brake fluid, because an opened bottle can possibly incorporate air into it, and if it's been sitting for a while, it won't be any better than the brake fluid that you currently have in your lines. The brake fluid types that are available is .3, .4. These two, these are the same. So .3, .4. There's also .5 and there's .5.1. The only differences between these brake fluids is going to be boiling point, and .5 is different individually from the rest because that one is silicone based. As you ride the brakes really hard, the heat transferred from the brake pads is going to get transferred into your brake lines, and if you have any moisture in your lines, it's going to vaporize any of the water, creating an air pocket, which is compressible, and you want a non-compressible fluid in your lines, otherwise you're going to get a spongy feel. So if this was the lever and this was the brake caliper, the piston, when you go to push the lever, it's going to move immediately. But if you have air inside the lines, you have a gap. So when you squeeze the lever, you have more travel before you have any movement at the other end. So that's why you change out your brake fluids, so that you reduce the amount of water. .3, .4, and .5.1 are all glycol-based oils or fluids, so they can be mixed together, but always look at your service manual or follow the cap telling you what fluid to put in your vehicle. Brake fluid except .5 is hydrophilic, which means that it absorbs moisture from the air. Normally you're going to change your brake fluid every 2 years, because even though it's a sealed system, some air can leak through and seep into the lines. .5 is hydrophobic, meaning it does not allow any fluid inside of it. It doesn't attract it. The main difference between .3, .4, and .5.1 is going to be boiling points. .3 is more of an outdated oil, and its boiling point is lower as opposed to .4, and .4's boiling point is a little bit lower compared to .5.1. Whenever water gets absorbed into the brake fluid, it's going to decrease the boiling point. And you want to make sure that your boiling point is as high as possible, especially if you're doing anything race oriented or you're really hard out on the road. The harder you use your brakes, the hotter they're going to get, and the more likely it is that your brake fluid can boil, so you want to make sure you use a quality brake fluid. Signs that you'll notice when you know you need to change your brake fluid is, for one, if you bought a new bike and you didn't know when it was done previously, that's one reason for you to change your brake fluid. The other one is, as time goes on, brake fluid does become a little bit darker. It's normally supposed to be roughly vegetable oil. It's kind of be that kind of color. So it should be almost clear with a slight yellow tint. If it's looking brown, black, anything dark, you definitely want to change that out, because that means that it's absorbed a good amount of water inside of it and it's pretty old. Another sign will be a spongy brake lever. That spongy feel you get is whenever you have those air gaps or that water or whatever, and it's going to compress and it's going to feel spongy instead of being straight from one to the other. So if you got a spongy brake feel and you feel like your brakes aren't working as effectively as they did when it was brand new, that's probably another reason to change it. Now you might think that because DOT5 doesn't absorb water, it's probably a better fluid for your application. The reason it was developed, it was for the military, and it was used so that, because that property does not absorb water, so those vehicles, Humvees or anything that uses brakes and uses brake fluid, is allowed to sit for years at a time without the brake fluid requiring to be changed because of its intake of water. This is not something that works very well with motorcycles and cars, simply because the other specs are not up to par for what we're going to be using it for. I want to give a big shout out to Fit Tools. They actually gave me a pretty nice discount on this. And even though that's the case, my reviews on any tool that I do are going to be extremely truthful. Just because they either give me something for free or give me a discount on something, I will never just say that it's a good product simply because of that. So I really appreciate it. I love it. From using it this entire time, I found out that this is an extremely useful and very good quality tool. I recommend it to anyone. And I actually was talking to them and they gave me a link for a 20% discount for the rest of you guys. So I'll post the link in the description and you'll be able to get it for 20% off. And hopefully that you like this tool. And if, like I said, there's also the conventional method of bleeding. If you don't like to go this route, you can also pick up a little water bottle with a hose and go that route. Either way, it's going to be able to do this. It's going to be able to do the same thing and bleed the brakes. This one just makes your life a little bit easier. So that's pretty much it, you guys. I really appreciate it. I know this is a really long video. I'm sorry. You're trying to do all this stuff and set up the camera and all that. It takes a while. So I know that long videos aren't the best thing for you to see, but I hope I was able to help you guys out. And as always, do not do a brake job or anything brake related if you are unsure that you can do it. Send it to a certified licensed mechanic, someone who knows what they're doing, and never experiment with your brakes unless you are completely sure you know what you're doing. And with that, comment down below. I hope to hear from you guys. Let me know how I'm doing. If you have any questions, feel free to throw it down there. I also have Facebook and Instagram, so you guys can hit me up through that. I'll post all that in the description. And go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're new, welcome. Hopefully that these videos will help you out a little bit. And as always, I'm the Motorcycle Boss. I'll see you guys later.